Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships. Okay, welcome to Relationships Inside Out podcast. This week, we're going to be talking about communication. Communication in general, maybe touching on communication and conflict, but how do we in relationships communicate and communicate well?
This is such an important topic because I think any podcast we have on any topic, communication is going to be at the focal point.
This is another one that's going to come up repeatedly because if we aren't communicating well, all the other stuff kind of goes to the wayside.
Yes. And communication is really how you get your needs met.
Mm-hmm.
It's how you let somebody know that you're not okay. Mm-hmm. Or listing your boundaries to somebody.
Or that you like something.
Yeah.
Or that something is working. Mm-hmm.
And I think so when we interact, cycles happen, right? Mm-hmm. So based on our presence and how we respond, whether we're critical or maybe we kind of distance or withdraw or quiet, those interact with the partner, right? Mm-hmm. And that influences how they respond. And this is what we call that interaction cycle. But these interaction cycles are really key to understanding what is happening in these communication patterns to make them effective or not effective, right? Because there's interaction cycles that we call negative interaction cycles. Typically, I think the most common is pursuer distancer, where one partner is trying to get their need met, but it's coming off critical. And the other partner distances because they feel like they're not doing a good job. So I'm just going to kind of get in a freeze response. And then that kind of freeze response is perceived as they don't care. So then they might pursue more. But really kind of, I think, having knowledge of what our cycle is and to break it, to have effective communications, because typically in conflict, we go into these cycles. We go to what we know best.
When I think about communication as a dance, and that's how I talk to couples or families about communication, is what is your role in the dance? Because everybody plays a role in that dance. Mm-hmm. Some good roles, some not so good roles. And so being able to identify what's my role, what's my partner's role, where are we really strong, what needs to grow.
And when we're communicating, I think we all have a hard time doing this. And that is actually listening. One way to break that is to be curious, not respond to what our partner's doing. Okay, they're criticizing, I'm going to distance, but more of like, I wonder why. I wonder what's going on for them. Being curious, but you have to listen to pick these things up. And listening is just as important, if not more important, than getting your own agenda across.
And listening isn't the same as hearing. So I have people who will come and say like, no, I heard them. But did you listen?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I listened because I heard them. They're not synonymous. Listening is, I am hearing the words you're saying. I'm taking them in. I'm monitoring my reaction. What I'm not doing is forming my response. That's hearing.
Yeah.
If I'm sitting there thinking about my response, I'm not listening very well.
That's tough. As you're talking right now, I'm formulating my response.
And it will happen. Yeah. But how can I temper that a bit so that I can actually get the full breadth of what my partner's trying to tell me without just being ready for rebuttal or defensiveness or whatever it might be?
Yeah. And you use the language dance, and then which is similar as the interaction cycle, right? And what I often see is in that dance, people are trying to get their own agenda or get their perspective validated. And in that kind of process, they're not validating their partner. They're not responding or listening. And that leads to conflict, right? That's a negative interaction cycle.
But I think what's important too is what are some of the positive interaction cycles? How does that look?
Validating, right? Meeting the needs, being curious. I think one thing, especially with couples, when I ask them, do you know what your partner needs to feel validated? A lot of them don't even know what they need themselves. And I love the Gary Chapman 5 love languages, right? You can literally go online, take a test for free. And it just is a starting point to get a sense of, how am I validated? And the 5 love languages are words of affirmation, quality time,
gift giving.
Yep, gift giving, acts of service, and physical touch.
Physical touch. Oh, man.
There you go.
My brain totally went blank. Yeah. And those can change.
They can change. You might have a couple that are higher and you may not be able to meet one, but giving a roadmap for your partner and communicating, this is how I'm validated. And being able to validate their conflict. And when we talk about validation, when we validate someone, we're not communicating that we agree with what's going on with them. We don't agree with their perspective. It's, I can see how you've got there. I can see how you feel that way. And that means a lot when you're on the receiving end of that is, if you feel you've been wrong, just validating, I can see how you felt that way. And just understanding that can help reduce defensiveness, which then kind of breaks that negative interaction cycles. And then you can engage in some positive ones where there's more effectiveness in helping resolve conflict or talking about finances, which is
it's a hard one.
Yeah.
We all just want to be seen and heard.
Yes.
So if I can tell my partner, if he comes to me and says, Kim, it hurt me when you did X, Y, and Z, called X, Y, Z statements. So it hurt me when you didn't do the laundry like you said you would. Not that my husband would ever say that sentence, but if he did, if I can look at him and say, so I'm hearing you're hurt that I didn't get that done. You felt let down, maybe. He feels seen and heard, even if inside I'm like, it's laundry.
Yes.
Right. He doesn't need to know that that's the piece of my reaction, but he can hear she's listening. She gets what I'm trying to say.
You bring up a couple of really good perspective or points there. One is the you language. When we're talking about how somebody makes us feel, or we do not want to be like, you made me feel, you didn't do this.
Yep.
And that speaks to the second point, is a really healthy way in an interaction cycle is to discuss the emotions that are underlining your drive. Like, I feel I need to distance right now. Right. So when we do that and talk about the emotions, it helps reduce the defensiveness. So instead of responding to behaviors of, well, you're criticizing me, right? Or whatever. And it's like, I'm hurt.
I am.
Yeah.
And it's, I love clients who will say, okay, I used an I statement. I feel like you're an asshole. That's not a feeling, right? So making sure that we're authentically giving a feeling, not a reaction, not a label or response, but saying, I feel hurt, angry, frustrated, like actually tapping into that emotional language allows for greater conversation. Yeah.
Good example of this. I've had couples do this quite a bit. And what will happen is they'll be arguing about who did what and who did not. And that really to me is defensiveness. You're really defending this underlying emotion or fear. And when we get to it, for example, one client was, they feared they failed their partner. So when they said that, the other partner's defenses went down and they were able to attend to the emotions rather than attend to the attack of, well, you did this, right? And that emotions, I think, is a really good way to cut through that tension and defensiveness. But the important piece is there has to be a sense of safety that you can be that vulnerable.
Such a good point.
And that happens when you continually practice and are very conscientious of good interactions, right? Breaking those negative interactions in the cycles of criticism. There's John Gottman identifies the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? If you see these in relationships, they tend to be predictive of not so many good things.
Not good things.
But we all have them. So we have them. But one of those is defensiveness. So we're defensive, right? We're always kind of trying to make sure that we're defending our vulnerability to not be good enough for our partner or something like that, right?
And our own worth.
Worth, in that relationship, right? And then criticism, that's kind of self-explanatory. And then there's contempt. I see this so much. This is like the eye rolls, right? Not
the resentment.
The resentment,
The low level, I talk about it like a low leveling simmer of irritation with your partner 24/7.
Invisibly showing that. Crossing the arms, turning your head, right? Turning your head when you cross your arms.
Sitting on opposite sides of the couch. Rejecting your partner trying to hold your hand or touch your hand. And
then there's stonewalling. This one is probably one of the most interesting to me because when we look at the interaction cycles of the dance, stonewalling is when somebody shuts down. They're sitting there. There's not much response from them. And then you have the other partner being like, what's going on? Why didn't you do this? What's going, you're not even listening to me. And that stonewalling is often perceived. I mean, it's distancing, but they're distancing because they don't care. But what's actually happened on a physiological level, their cardiovascular response, their heart rate variability is so high, right? Like it's going really high. It's actually more than the person criticizing. So if we really think about it in that perspective, it's a freeze response. But it brings up the point of my perception of my partner's response influences how I then interact with them.
Such a good point too, right? How I see my partner respond to my needs, to my communication will impact how then I continue to communicate. If I go out on a limb and my partner is being critical and I say, that hurts me, and then they continue or push harder or tell me I'm wrong, I'm probably going to go to stonewalling. I'm going to shut down because my body goes into that fight, flight, or freeze, as you were talking about. And I think of it as like if we have a computer with too many tabs open, right? It's going to short circuit at some
That's
point.
me. Yeah.
And how do we keep our body and our brains from short circuiting? How do we keep them from shutting down?
Yeah. And you bring up a good point. You know, I've noticed even with myself over the years is I tend to be a pursuer, right? But I've been in relationships where somebody's pursued more than me and I've inadvertently distanced.
Interesting.
Right.
And so it can change, right? Or I might be someone with a parent or a sibling or friend and different than with my partner.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, these cycles exist with friends. I mean, anytime you're interacting with somebody, there's a cycle. And is it a good one? Is it not? When I say this, how is it met? And I think, and a really important part going back to that dance is couples are often trying to change the other partner's side of the dance. We can never really control the other person's side of the cycle. We can't control their role in this dance. We can only change what we do to influence their side of the cycle, right? So if I stop pursuing as much, how is that met, right? And it's over time that you start breaking these negative interaction cycles, get more positive. We start feeling safer, safer to be vulnerable. I feel if I'm more vulnerable, I'm not going to get attacked or they're not going to distance themselves from me.
I think what's important too is to consider, how do we avoid getting into these cycles? How do we, if I'm noticing I'm getting, say I'm a pursuer, sometimes I am, sometimes I'm a distancer. It's very confusing for my poor husband. If I am in pursuer mode, how do I avoid getting to the point where I feel like I have to actively pursue him after he's long shut down? And some of that is things like a couple's pause or a couple's timeout. So I talk to my clients about thinking about it as green, yellow, red. Green, I'm good to go for a conversation. I feel open to receiving what's being shared, good or bad. Yellow, I'm starting to get prickly, right? I think of like a porcupine. And I talk about this. I'll talk about this a lot. But I'm starting to get prickly, probably not my best self. I'm probably losing parts of my brain, such as my prefrontal cortex, that are crucial for healthy and effective communication. And then red, that's when we've lost all sense of empathy. We are simply reactive and defensive at that point. So how do we catch it when we're starting to go from green to yellow rather than yellow, burnt orange, red? Because that is a slippery slope. Once we've hit yellow, pausing anything is really hard, really hard.
Some of us are green to red.
It's true.
Right. But it's a really good point you're talking about. And having that conversation, communicating with your partner of what that looks like, and even setting up that expectation that we will communicate this to each other when this is going on.
And that we notice our partner doing it. Because sometimes I don't have the awareness to catch myself at yellow, but my partner can see my jaw tensing, can see my hands tensing, can see me kind of pushing back in my seat. That's his cue where he can look at me and say, like we talked about this in a previous one, but where he can look at me and say, Kim, yellow. And that is a word for me now where I hear it and it's a cue for me to check in with myself.
Yeah.
For me to say, okay, I am a little anxious. I am defensive. I'm not feeling like my best self. And it also invites me to go take a break.
Yeah.
To go take a timeout or a pause. And I can do the same in return for my husband. We've created that word. So it's non-judgmental. It's just a cue of, hey, I'm noticing.
Yeah.
But also calling it for ourselves. If I am noticing myself, we're in conversation. He wants to keep going. And I'm like, no, this isn't good.
Yeah.
I can say yellow and we can take that break.
Yeah, because once we're in that point, and you talked about the prefrontal cortex, and just for those people, that's the front of your brain, kind of right behind your forehead, but that's really responsible for the higher order thinking, that self-control. But when we're super stressed, we tend to be more functioning from the emotional, right, part of the brain and responsive, more that fight, flight, or freeze. When you're talking about kind of getting to that point and the defensiveness, anytime that comes up, there's not productive conversation. And being aware of that or helping each other do that. And kind of some of the language you use, right? You said timeout. I love what you do for timeouts. So I want you to talk about that process, because timeouts, depending on how it's approached, can sound very juvenile if a partner says that. So, but timeouts are extremely, extremely important to interrupt that negative interaction cycle when it gets that tense, when both people are in reds, maybe even yellows, right?
Yep. So I talk about ground rules with people around timeouts. Timeouts have this really bad connotation of being punishment. And in our house, whether it's with parenting or in our relationship, timeouts are actually a chance to breathe. They're a chance to slow down our nervous system, to slow down our brain, to really check in and invite some self-soothing.
Yeah.
So even for our daughter, when she's doing something naughty, it's a reaction to something she's feeling, something that's essentially misfiring in her body. And so we we talk about timeouts with couples in kind of the same context. Your body is now reaching its capacity, or your mind. So take that time out. So I tell couples, rather than just walking away, which is where we're tempted to do sometimes, which is honestly really damaging for relationships. We can look at our partner and say, I need a timeout. Okay, here's some of the ground rules for that. Timeouts need at least 20 minutes to get that PFC or prefrontal cortex back on board, sometimes more. So I'm going to call a timeout. Sometimes we use like a T hand gesture.
So the nonverbals, right?
And it's saying, okay, it's noon. I'm going to take a timeout. It's noon. Chris, I'll be back at 12:20. Let's meet here. So it's giving a time. It's giving a location to return, and you have to return. That is so important. Sometimes we take that time out and then we're like, oh, we'll just sweep it under the rug, or I don't feel like going back to them. You have to come back. And in that 20 minutes, it's not a time to sharpen our swords. It's not a time to, oh, I'm going to prove this point when I get back in there. It's a time to listen to music, stretch, run, whatever it is, to calm your body so you can go back in and say those I feels or I need statements. But what's important too is after 20 minutes, sometimes we need more. Sometimes at 20 minutes, I'm still fired up. So then it's saying to my partner, coming back at 12:20 still, and saying, you know what, hon, I need another 20 minutes. Calling it and coming back.
Yeah.
But if we can count on our partner to use that time to soothe and be effective, but also use that time to cool down, regroup, and make sure they're going to come back, it creates a safe place to have conflict, to count on our partner not to abandon us.
And that is our responsibility in the cycle. Being able to be more effective in the sense of how I'm going to approach my partner or reapproach this. And that self-soothing is part of that responsibility. I control how I'm feeling and whether I come back to this stuff. One thing that you, I think, said is really important that I want to touch on again is having a discussion of how you call timeout. I've had couples that started and said timeout, and they're like, I don't like that language. I feel like I'm putting a dunce hat on and turning around and going into the corner in my grade school class, right? So they come up with like creative terms. So talk about what is that language we're going to use. Is it a nonverbal? Because that's less defensive. Another thing too, I've noticed some partners will do is they'll get their piece across, timeout. If you're going to have a piece, try to let the other piece happen, and then your partner's piece happen, and then say, maybe we need a timeout right now, or however you decide to kind of call that. What are your thoughts kind of on?
Yeah. And thinking about your intention behind it. Is it to get my point across and shut down the rebuttal? Is it to be punitive, or is it really because I want to be curious and I want to hear you, but I can't right now? So examining yourself and what's leading to that timeout.
Yes. Yeah, you want to be able to put yourself in a better position to be able to navigate this. If we stay in that defensive state, it's not going to happen. One thing I think is interesting that I've noticed anecdotally in kind of my work with the clients is if they're an internal or an external processor, that changes the time they need. So I'll use my wife and I, for example. I'm an external processor. She's internal. When we have conflict, she tends to be the one that needs to process. So for an internal processor, they need time to figure it all out, to navigate in their head.
To think privately,
to make sure, because there's a lot of anxiety around not knowing what to say or how to say it and coming out with the right words. Whereas someone like me, an external processor, I'm good with just venting. I may not need them to do anything, just a sounding board, but it causes a lot of stress for them and they may need time out. So for an external processor, it's just getting it out. But an internal processor may need more time. And the external processor specifically needs, I think, a little bit more difficult, or has a little more difficulty self-soothing in that time, because we need to talk. But really learning that if your partner is an internal processor, talking about that, what is a comfortable time, and understanding you need a comfortable time. And if you're an external processor, self-soothing in that moment.
I talk about redistributing that energy to other places. So if you're an external processor, we have this angst or this energy or anxiety about, I need to talk about it right now. Use the energy to something else. So instead of sitting in a quiet room and meditating, that probably won't be very effective. Choose something like running on that break, punching bag, doing something where you're using some of that energy and that angst that's building up. And that can be a helpful way of making it so those 20, 30, 40 minutes feel safe for both people.
Yeah. And when you do these skills, right, the timeouts, you understand what's a negative interaction cycle, what to do to stop pursuing or stop distancing. I think it's really important to talk about a lot of this is where you are able to talk about a little more of the deeper stuff that needs to be discussed, right? That cause a lot of stress for you. Because we're not able to talk about, say, finances, right? You know, finances is in the top of the list of divorce, but typically it's not finances, it's how you navigate that. And this stuff is getting this communication down is the foundation to navigate the shit together as a couple in that relationship.
And getting those needs met. How can my partner, and you alluded to this earlier, how can my partner know what my needs are if I don't even know what they are?
Yes.
If I haven't told him what they are, I hate to break it to everyone listening, they're not a mind reader. Your husband, wife, partner is never going to be a mind reader. So let it go.
Yeah.
We have this belief that our partner should know us. They should know how to take care of me. They should know what to do. They should
hear that so
know.
much.
Yes.
They should know. Don't you think?
We've been together so many years. Why don't they know? Because I'll ask them the question, did you tell them? Well, no. Well, then how the shit is he supposed to know? You got to tell them.
Don't set each other up for failure by not communicating what it is you need. And that's our responsibility. What do we need so we can be able to communicate that and not diffuse that responsibility on our partner that they should know? I can't tell you, and going back to kind of the love languages and even identifying what our partners are. I can't tell you how many couples have been together like 17 years, 30 years, and they're like, I just don't feel loved. And the other partner is just devastated because they've been trying and they have been busting their ass, but they've been doing it in a way that doesn't really meet the needs of the client, right? Go back to love language. Maybe they're words of affirmation, but the other partner is just doing acts of service around the house, like making sure that they're not stressed about dishes or things like that. And they've been doing that. And then their kind of effort has been invalidated. But that really comes down to communicating in the very get-go of what it is that I need and what can you do for me in these times. And it could change.
Yep. And so, and I think that brings up another piece of, it's not just what are you doing wrong? It's what are you doing well that is filling up my cup, that is serving our marriage, our home, our children, me, whatever. Because again, just as he can't spontaneously come up with these things, if he's trying things and I'm not giving him feedback that it's working, he's probably not going to keep doing those things.
Yes.
So guiding our partner, your partner, yes, they know you in ways other people won't, and they're still fallible. They're still going to forget things. They're still going to screw up. They're still going to have those blind spots that every person has, right? I can know my partner in many ways and still fall short in meeting his needs if I don't ask him what they are, even as a therapist.
Yeah. I jokingly say, you have to train our partners. My wife does a good job training.
This is so tough because communication starts from infancy. Did we, growing up, gain the tools to have healthy communication? Could we recognize that they were unhealthy or healthy if we were asked? Probably not. And so how do we then tackle, okay, I can see this isn't healthy. How do I make a difference? That's when we try things like validation. We try things like getting curious, asking our partner. If in those conversations, you need to take a pause and ask for clarification, do that.
And not think about your own agenda. And
really try such a big piece.
And even asking for clarity is a way to validate your partner and that you're listening to them.
We can't be, just as we can't expect our partner to know it all, we can't. So if I can say to my partner, I'm not tracking what you're saying. I'm not getting it. And that's a sentence we use in our house a lot of, I'm not tracking this. It gives him a chance to reframe so I can actually hear it and actually do something different.
Yeah.
If I pretend like I know it and then I continue not to do it well, that's probably going to hurt him deeper, leading to one of those 4 horsemen you were talking about with contempt or defensiveness.
Which perpetuate those negative interaction cycles. And you brought up earlier, like from childhood communicating. I mean, the cycles that we engage with our partners are very similar to what we grew up with. If we're used to conflict and our parents yelling and screaming at each other, that's typically how we do it. And it's so normal, right? I have many couples where that partner is so vocal about how they feel. And the other one grew up in a family where they don't talk about feelings. It is very overwhelming for them, right? So really understanding how this communication pattern that you've learned and understanding, is this helpful with my partner? And do I need to adapt or change it for this relationship?
What's funny is besides getting my own therapy and stuff, but one of the greatest points of reflection for me is having my 4.5-year-old daughter, because she will imitate things we say, the ways we interact. She'll do things and we'll say, Harper, like, that's not kind. And she'll turn and say, well, you do it, or dad does it, or grandma does it, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that moment where it's like, oh, should I do?
Yeah.
Right. And so being able to be open to that feedback from our partner, from our children, whoever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
But even as therapists, we're always growing. We're learning. Even if we have all the tools in the toolbox to give everyone else,
mm-hmm.
using it is hard. It's hard. And everyone is fallible in this area
at
some point.
Yeah. Even being trained in it. There'd be times that I unsuccessfully communicated with my wife, and
never
afterwards I'm like, oh my God, I could have done this. But understanding that I'm human, giving myself that grace, right? Because none of us are perfect, but all we can do is try to better this process.
Yeah.
And kind of in that need to make this dynamic safe, where we feel safe. I love kind of what Gottman does in the speaker listener activity, where you provide structure, and structure is really important to feel safe, right? Because there's rules around it. And when you're having those hard conversations, that structure serves as kind of that.
It could be a saving point in communication.
Yeah. And what this technique does is it really, like I have couples, they do 5 minutes, right? Each one gets about 5 minutes. They may not need that. Where one person's talking and expressing their feelings, not using you language.
So using I
and talking about their experience and how X made me feel. Not a person, but like how this situation made me feel is usually. And the person listening, which I think is the harder role, is, like you said earlier, not formulating your response, right? Being curious, being attentive, but self-soothing. Because some of the stuff you might hear might trigger you, and you might be distressed. So what is it that you need to self-soothe in there? So practicing that, but providing that structure. And when these conversations get, maybe out of hand, if you will, go back to this foundational 5-minute speaker listener. And it's really not about exchanging sometimes conversations. It's just, this is what I have to say. This is what I have to say. And sometimes we'll adapt and evolve that into paraphrasing, like some of the listening stuff, like saying back to what your partner heard, getting clarity to the, like Gottman says, getting the clarity to the liking of the person who's speaking.
And repeating their words, not the words I want to hear or think I'm hearing. It's not repeating back my perception of what they said. It is, my husband says, I feel hurt that you didn't do the laundry. It's me saying, I hear that you feel hurt that I didn't do the laundry. It's not, well, I hear that you were overly needy and blah, 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 right?
Yeah. Which
can be tempting.
Yeah.
It's simply using his words, letting him know I'm hear him. Super important.
Yeah. I mean, I like to pull out what I want to hear for my own benefit. Confirmation bias.
So do you let each partner talk for a solid 5 minutes?
If they need it.
It can be hard to stay attuned for 5 minutes to what someone's saying.
Well, and I really want to talk about their experience. So then I talk to the listener and say, what went on for you, right? What triggered you? What was it specifically that, and it gives myself, but also their partner, like, what words were you using that kind of set this off? So maybe I shouldn't use this again, or, thinking about how I can learn what is really going on for my partner, right? Because this helps the speaker know, oh, my partner is feeling this way. And then when they said they felt this way, but what I observed was they actually kind of the eyes weren't connecting with me. They were moving around, which is kind of symbolic of maybe distancing, right? And so it's like, wow, they're not. They actually just felt attacked or invalidated because my need made them feel like they weren't doing a good enough job, right? Or something to that extent.
And as we're going through this, be gentle with yourself, because it might be hard to stay present, to stay curious and conscious in the whole conversation. And that's okay. Notice it and just try to bring your mind and body back. One thing I tell clients is, if you want to focus on something, you point your belly button where you want your attention to be. You're more likely to focus then on wherever your torso is pointed.
Sure. Yeah.
So if we're trying to have a conversation with my shoulder to you, I'm going to tune out because I'm going to be looking further out in the distance or dinking with my phone.
Yeah.
Whereas if we are face to face, belly buttons pointed at one another, we're more likely to stay engaged in that conversation.
I like that. And kind of what you said just a little bit ago kind of brought up this idea that we need to communicate if it's okay to communicate right now. One partner may not be in a state of mind. I know sometimes I'm like overwhelmed and drained, and my wife will come to me, hey, I wanted to talk about X. Is this a good time, or do you want to put it to another time?
Yes. Asking that permission. Super helpful. Is it okay? Yeah. Do you have space right now? If not, when can we do that?
Yeah. You don't want to bombard your partner when they come home from work and you're just like, okay, we need to talk about this shit.
I talk about it with boundaries of, we often, if we need help, say moving something, we'll ask someone, can you help me move this? But yet the same load in an emotional way. We don't ask permission of our friends or our family. We just unload.
Mm-hmm.
We just expect that they are okay with it.
Yeah.
And they might not be.
They may not be in the place, and then you might not get the response you want, and then ensues that negative interaction cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So just being aware and making sure that we're both in a place to talk about something, right? Like, I want to set up camping trips. Are you in a place to talk about this stuff right now? Or, I mean, it could be something simple, or it could be something very serious, but then maybe you put in that structure of the 5 minute. And even outside of that, right, is communication serves as a way to connect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Communicating, I can connect, like, let's talk about something.
And how do we pull communication, healthy communication, into things like sex and play and all the different realms? It's not just around conflict. That's where we might most often talk about it, because there's an issue to be had. But it's important that healthy communication also exists around planning for our dreams, around sex and what feels good for both bodies in that space, what feels safe, what we both desire in terms of play. How do I enjoy my time off? How do I fill my cup up or relax or whatever it might be? But continuing that kind of conversation too, and that kind of communication.
And a little bit now that we've been talking about is communication within and about the relationship. But there's also communication about stress that's external to the relationship. I find there's some contention there based on how the partner responds, right? And, you know, I'll use a stereotypical example. In a heterosexual relationship, the male tries to fix it. It's so uncomfortable, right? So the female partner comes home and talking about stress from work, and then the male partner's just, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And it comes off as blaming. So even thinking about how we're conversing when we're trying to be there for our partner to help them manage stress external to the relationship, we need to communicate effectively there to not kind of put them in that defensive mode and not feel comfortable coming to you anymore.
And again, back to what we were saying at the beginning, but positive communication. I love that you do this. I enjoy you in this way. I'm grateful for. All of these are great starters to a sentence that can let your partner know communication is okay.
Yes.
To let them know they're on the right track. The relationship's on the right track. It's so important. In therapy, we get problem saturated, right? Where we focus only on what's going wrong sometimes. But it's vital that we also pay attention to what is going well.
Yeah.
How do we notice what's going well? Think about what maybe led to that positive change, if there was positive change, and how do we keep that going? How do we communicate about that to keep it going?
Yeah, I love that. The positivity. It actually speaks to kind of Gottman in that research. They've come up with a ratio of how many positive interactions you need to have for every one. And it's different for like lay time versus conflict. And in conflict, it's 5 positives, every 1 negative.
Which think about that. If
I don't even
you
do that.
say 1 negative thing to your partner, that theory then argues we have to have 5 positives come in to negate that 1 negative statement. Yeah. Which, if you look at most relationships, that isn't happening.
No, I can't even say that I am affected all the time.
It's really difficult.
And when not in conflict, it's around 20 to 1.
Whew.
And I think about the reason for that, right? So they talk about in their research, positive sentiment.
Yeah.
Right. This is the idea that when my partner or I make a mistake, we can give each other the benefit of the doubt rather than kind of the negative sentiment of they're a jerk or whatever it might be. So more positive interactions, getting that healthy communication kind of builds that bank for that positive sentiment, right? Which is predictive of good relationship outcomes. And
not using that downtime just to be on our phones or doing things separate, but using that to build positive interactions so that what I've seen couples struggle with is, okay, we're at work for most of the day, so we're not together. Then we come home and we're sitting on our phone. Okay, we're really not together at that point either. So the only time we communicate is, hey, I am upset about this, or I need you to do this chore for me, or whatever.
I love that.
And instead, we've got to create more pockets of time for those positive things to happen. So it doesn't feel like all of our communication is problem centered.
And let's go back to the validating. Spend time validating your partner. What do you appreciate? Right? What are some things that you appreciate they did in this day or over time in the relationship?
Even if it's small, or we've said it before, say it again. You can't share too many gratitudes. You can't over appreciate your partner, but we can be overcritical.
Yeah. And we tend to be problem saturated. And I think you hit the nail on the head is we tend to want to talk with our partners when there's a problem. Why not when things are right, when things are going well? And this goes back to, I'll use the term I used before, training our partners. We have to let them know what's going well and what they appreciate so they continue to do that. Because if that feels good, I'm going to continue doing that.
But also be open to receiving that too. If my partner's saying, hey, I love that you did this thing, or I would love if you would do this thing, be open to it.
Yeah.
Give it a try. Continue what it is they're telling you is working.
Yeah. And I did want to circle back to a little bit about the managing stress external to the relationship, right? Making sure we have positive interactions there as well. Gottman has this 30-minute stress reduction conversation, but couples for 30 minutes talk about in the same sense of the 5-minute, right? The structure. But in here they talk, which I think is so important, is understanding from your partner, do they need you to solve it? Do you need to be on their team? Do they want you to be a part of the problem or just listening? And really understanding what role they want from you to be in that process instead of just being the problem solver all the time.
We don't like seeing people that are upset or uncomfortable. So we have to want to just solve.
Yeah.
That's not really what we need. Sometimes we just need someone to say, that sounds really tough.
Yes.
Really tough.
Yeah.
Or, man, I can't believe that happened. I'm sorry you went through that.
Even if you don't agree with it fully and you can see where your partner could have changed things, right? That's the hard part. But just saying like, yeah, exactly. That is tough. But really, where do you want me? Like my wife does a great job. Like, so do you want my input or do you want me just to listen, to be a sounding board? Again, what is that position? But they say around 30 minutes, right? So at night, 30 minutes of just, I need to talk about the stress and not to the relationship, external to the relationship.
Yeah, I love that. I love that.
It's a way to connect, to feel like a team.
Setting ourselves up for success. If I know the role my partner wants me to be in, I'm likely to be more successful.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm trying to guess, I'm probably going to step on a landmine at some point.
Yeah. So I think some of the important things that we've kind of discussed so far are the interaction cycles. They're negative and positive. Figure out what your negative ones are. How are you contributing to that? You can't control the partner side of it, right? We may need timeouts, right? You want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the timeout stuff, just to recap?
Yeah. So as a recap, the big one is always come back. Set that time and come back.
Yeah.
You can even just call if you're gradually going up to yellow. I talk about couples saying, I need a pause.
Yeah.
We don't have to actually leave spaces. We don't have to take a big break, but I need a pause just to think about what you just said, or can we pause so you can reframe that for me, or whatever it might be. And that gives a chance to make sure we're not losing something in the mix. But again, those ground rules for timeouts were setting a time limit, being specific on the time and location when you're coming back, using that time to soften and to open up and become more curious, and making sure you're coming back. I emphasize that because so often we storm out on our partner because we see that, and that can be really damaging to relationships.
And in that time, like you said, self-soothe so you can come back where you're not defensive. Because if we're defensive, we're going to be in our negative interaction cycle. And
in future podcasts, we're going to talk about how to self-soothe, how to have compassion, how to have grace, how to honor what you're feeling, and how to relax our body in that space.
Yeah. And if these conversations, because communication is so important to really give a sense of safety that we can go to each other for these things. And if they're too tough, put structure around it with that 5-minute speaker listener, right? 5 minutes, someone gets to talk, the other one doesn't say anything, just listens, and then switch, right?
What I love too with couples is as they see their communication change as a couple, they notice it improves in their friendships, their family relationships. The way we communicate with, say, my husband or our partner often is a reflection of how I might communicate with other people too.
Yeah.
Just in a much more magnified sense.
Yeah. Especially when you become more conscientious of the cycle and the dance, right? But also it improves intimacy in the relationship. You feel more connected. That safety, right? And then also if setting up parameters around managing stress external to the relationship, that it's not just throughout the whole day, maybe just schedule a certain time, do 30 minutes of helping each other out and really understanding what it is each other need in those moments of talking about that, right? How do we feel validated? What role do you want me to take? Again, listener or input or
not judging our partner for what their needs might be, how they might soothe differently, or if they are internal versus external processors, really focusing on how do we not judge them for that?
Yeah.
Honor it without the judgment.
Yeah. The internal, external, right? That kind of really can shape how much time we need to process. And it's just, we process things differently, and that's okay.
And I think as corny as it is, this conversation about communication is going to keep coming up in so many different topics, because we can't have quality sexual relationships without good conversation.
Yes.
We can't have quality play with one another, or even we can't have a quality relationship with ourselves, with our family, if we don't talk about it.
Yes.
If we don't give room to process, to think, to test things out, kind of fail sometimes. So it comes up in any topic that we're going to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for example, like boundaries, right? We have to know how to communicate with that individual without putting on the defensive.
Yeah.
Right. To say, these are my needs, without putting, again, on the defensive. So we can actually have a conversation about why that's important to us and things like that. So yes, it will show up a lot in our topics. And if there's anything else that we need to clarify, or you guys have questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to us via email. You can see that in our podcast description link.
It's relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. So
perfect.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. And thanks everyone for listening.